Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Birtwistle. I'm the Manufacturing Director responsible for all of our vertical activities in the manufacturing sector here at HSO. Very pleased to be able to welcome Fhaheen from Make UK. We're going to have a very interesting conversation about the state of manufacturing as seen by some of the research that Make UK have done. So Fhaheen, I'll pass over to you, let you introduce yourself a little bit, and then we'll get started.
Thank you very much, Matt. Yeah, so Fhaheen Khan, I'm a Senior Economist at Make UK. We are the manufacturers organization, formerly known as the Engineers Employers Federation, which some of you may recognize. My role is essentially to support our policy team, our lobbying function, in all the evidence-based lobbying that we do to ensure that the manufacturing sector is supported by the government.
Thank you. Yeah, and obviously you just recently published 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think it was, the report on Q1. So give us some of the headlines of the findings from that report.
Yeah, so our first quarter research was published a couple of weeks ago. And to give you a couple of bullet points, what we've seen is a rebound in activity following some declines that we saw in the previous year. So I'm going to draw up a quick slide just to sort of color the situation and what we've been seeing over the last couple of quarters or so, and why Q1 has actually been quite a surprising set of data for us specifically, and one for our members. So what you'll see here, output and orders are two of our main indicators that we measure. The data is measured as a sense of balance of change, which means that these are not magnitudes of change. So what we're looking at up here, where the line exceeds 40, is not a 40% growth on output or orders, but it's more of a sentiment of the share of businesses that are actually seeing an improvement in their performance. What we had seen throughout the majority of 2022 is that businesses were doing pretty well. Most businesses, manufacturers were growing in the UK, but every quarter after the next, there was a bit of a slowdown being experienced where the rate of growth for out orders was slowing down, and that was being followed by the rate of growth for output, which is also slowing down. And you can see that huge gap between the red bar and the orange bar on the kind of right-hand side, where manufacturers were actually seeing orders grow faster than output, which was a reflection of supply chain disruption. Q4 2022 was a pretty weak quarter for manufacturing, and our expectation was that this slowdown in trend was going to continue because it was a bit of a ski slope, I suppose you can describe it as. But what we have found is that for the start of this quarter, and if you can see my mouse circling the two little bars at the far right-hand side, output and orders has rebounded. And we see this throughout the survey results, not just in output orders. Our other metrics measured include the domestic market performance via orders, employment growth, investment growth, which has all rebounded slightly in comparison to the previous quarter. The only thing that perhaps is a concern at the moment from the latest sale results is that manufacturers continue to raise prices on their goods. So inflation is still a problem. And we've seen from the latest ONS results for the last 2 or 3 months is that inflation has been exceeding expectations of most economists as well. So I think that is a particular issue. But overall, in general, the results have been very, very strong. And we're also quite pleased about manufacturers actually performing better.
Yeah, and I think it was a point that you made as well, that sort of improvement in Q1 has really surprised a lot of the manufacturers. What do you think has, obviously there was a fair degree of pessimism, I think, seen at the end of 2022, but what do you think has caused that surprise?
Yeah. I think, Matt, I'm going to bring up another slide for you here to actually show you what was actually happening, because manufacturers themselves had to make a prediction of what they thought Q1 was going to look like. And it is a quite sharp difference in versus what was expected and what reality was. So what we are looking at here, and just to describe a little bit, there are two sets of series that we're looking at here. The bars are basically every quarter manufacturers are asked to predict what they think will happen in the following quarter, and the dots represent exactly what the results were when we finally concluded the survey for that particular quarter. If you look historically, manufacturers are always genuinely pretty good at predicting the the direction the industry was going to move in the following quarter. We can see that all changed during the pandemic, as I'm circling around 2020 Q2 and Q3. And as we saw the slowdown of the last couple of quarters or so, we were expecting, at least manufacturers were expecting, for the first time since the pandemic, manufacturers, if you looked at two little tiny negative bars, expecting a contraction in the overall growth in output and orders. And they were completely wrong about that. They actually had growth, which is just the two dots that are above, which is referencing the previous slide that we saw. What caused that? I think it's the back-to-back crises manufacturers have faced since maybe back since 2017 or 18, from the uncertainty that was resulting from UK and EU negotiations following the referendum in 2016, which created huge uncertainty for what the UK and European manufacturing relationship was going to look like, followed by the pandemic, followed by the energy crisis, followed by supply chain disruption and mass amounts of inflation, which has made it much more difficult for manufacturers to really predict what the next their performance is going to be like. The issue is, of course, manufacturers and all businesses, they can't accurately predict 2, 3, 4 years ahead, but you would expect that most businesses should be able to predict 3 months ahead. But what we have found is that it's actually become really, really difficult to do that in today's environment. Of course, our latest data suggests that manufacturers were wrong in a good way, because they outperformed their own expectations. But this could have easily been the other way around, where businesses were predicting better performance and they got more negative performance. And the issue is that manufacturers are unable to do that because the uncertainty in the environment is actually so bad. So it's something that we look at when we speak to government about introducing more certainty. I think having 3 or 4 prime ministers in the last couple of years doesn't necessarily help that situation for business. But it's pretty clear that it is having an impact. So just a bit of a kind of forward-looking view. Manufacturers do predict next quarter is going to be strong, but we cannot say with a certain degree of any certainty whether they're going to be right about that this time.
Yeah. So do you think confidence is returning to the sector?
I think confidence is always seen as a pretty volatile metric. The media, the news stories, the things that you hear about the UK economy and how it's performing does have an impact on that. I think at the moment manufacturers are quite upbeat, but in my experience, manufacturers tend to be a positive bunch of people, which I think often people underestimate how positive they are about their industry and what they do. Our results show, at least our own measurements of confidence, that manufacturers are more confident about their own business, but also the news stories surrounding the UK avoiding a recession towards the end of last year and actually growing just slightly more than 0% at the start of this year suggests that the economy may not be in as bad a shape as once previously thought. And so at the moment, businesses are confident, but I think they are cautiously confident because they are still behaving in a way that's slightly different to where they would have historically, where they're still stockpiling more, they're still holding more stock to ensure that in case there is disruption, they'll be able to meet that demand. So they have changed the way they do business, and there is some confidence there. But we all need to be a little bit cautious about that.
But if I was to ask you to look into your crystal ball for the next quarter, for the rest of the year, what do you think manufacturers can look forward to?
Yeah, I think there have been some positive changes in policy that introduced more kind of investment incentives, such as full expensing 100% capital allowances and changes to different like investments in green technology and that sort of thing. And I think manufacturers are, as far as we can see, are looking to invest more, and they can look for and find more opportunities for products development and that sort of thing. But our survey data, which shows a rebound, we're not entirely certain if this was a blip in the data, as in meaning a one-off scenario, because a lot of things were changing. And the 1st of April this year, corporation tax has increased from that point forward. The super deduction scheme, which is the 130% capital allowance deduction, was ending. The energy support for businesses was actually ending in its previous form, which was very, very generous. And it is entirely possible that manufacturers may have also taken the first quarter of this year to overproduce, to overorder, to ensure that they are safe, have a safety net for the rest of the year. So our forecasts currently still predict that manufacturing could still decline this year, because we have decided not to incorporate the first quarter survey results yet until we see what our Q2 results will look like, whether this is the start of a new trend of growth, or was this actually a one-off period of growth for Q1, and actually we're going to return to the 2022 trend. And I don't mean to sound very negative, but I am an economist and we're always pessimistic about the future. But I think the good thing is that we often tend to be wrong about everything we say. So we'll see how the rest of the year goes. But we are being cautious about our approach to forecasting.
Okay. I mean, are there any sort of industry sectors that stand out, either in terms of benefiting from improved performance, or maybe some sectors that may actually end up doing worse than we would have liked?
Yeah, actually, when we dive down into the actual nitty-gritty of the detail, we notice that the performance is actually not equally shared by all sectors. Of course, on average, manufacturing has grown for the start of this quarter, but some sectors have done better than others. Our own survey data indicates that industries like the electronics, the electrical equipment, mechanical, or the suppliers of technology and capital goods have done really, really well for the start of this quarter, which was surprising to us because those industries tend to cater for investment goods or investments that other businesses might make. They tend to cater to the technologies of that. Our assumption is that the super deduction expiring in the 31st of March this year may have played a role in that, where it was the last opportunity for businesses to actually benefit from the generous capital allowances that they may have received. But it's also entirely possible that it was the easing of certain supply chain disruptions that we've had last year, such as the shortage of semiconductors, which is still a problem today, but the issues have subsided a little bit in relative to last year, and also freight capacity improving. And if you split the data between, let's say, you divide it between producers of goods that consumers might use versus producers of, let's say, materials like metals, like plastics, paper, rubber, there is a difference between the material producers are actually performing worse than the goods producers, like the automotive companies, like the aerospace companies, the pharmaceutical companies are all expecting growth this year in comparison to the producers of metals, the producers of copper and paper and plastics, who are facing more inflation upstream than they are in comparison to businesses that are more downstream, that are facing slightly lower levels of inflation. So there is a difference there. We're not sure exactly what that could mean long-term for CPI and consumer inflation, because eventually those prices will be passed down. But I think the OBR from our perspective, or from Make UK's perspective, is that they are underestimating the impact of inflation from what we're seeing from Make UK's perspective.
Okay, and I guess in comparison to other countries, I mean, this is always the interesting thing, I mean, finding countries that are comparable to ourselves, be it Germany, be it France, or whatever. But what's your perception of what we're seeing across maybe the rest of Europe?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. So we have a quarterly discussion with a group known as CMET. So they are the Make UK equivalents of trade associations that represent the manufacturers in their respective countries, like in France, Germany, Italy, Spain, even the Nordics. And we have recently been joined by somebody from Australia, and we tend to share intelligence on how our perspective or respective industries are performing in our own countries. And it's very interesting how whenever we present the UK slide deck, which you have seen, the output and orders, and then they present their slide decks, and they always look almost identical. And I think we often are under the impression that the issues that the UK is facing in terms of performance, in terms of the trade, is UK specific, but actually countries like Germany, like France, like Italy are all facing the same issues around inflation. They're all facing the same issues around energy costs. They're all facing the same issues even around labor shortages and skills shortages. And actually a lot of the manufacturers there were struggling in 2022, and they all have similarly seen a slight rebound in activity in the start of 2023, all likely motivated by similar causes. Of course, the main differences between these countries is how business support varies. So we know in France, energy costs are significantly cheaper in comparison to the UK. So businesses over there are finding that less of an issue. But then there are countries like Finland and Sweden and Norway who really, really struggle with the labor shortages issue because nobody wants to live there. Apparently, according to their own words, they have a huge issue with brain drain, I guess is the term that is often used, where Finnish people. We were speaking to a delegate from Finland who said that people are just leaving Finland, and because they want to live in London and Paris and these kind of main cities, and so there are some issues there, and we do see those issues persisting, which makes it more difficult because if government want to, let's say, introduce generous immigration policies, it doesn't really help if there are no people in those countries as well who could move here, because they also lack people and they are also implementing their own generous immigration policies to attract things the other way. So it's a balancing act, and it is very interesting whenever we see those results.
Yeah, and if I can just add a follow-up question to that, because it's very interesting in what you said there about how each country has its perceptions that probably are different than that. Because I know we're really pushing very hard to get government to stand behind manufacturers more, to support more, invest more, either in areas of the batteries, for example, or semiconductors. Is that something that you feel would actually really make a big difference in the manufacturing sector, having that big government investment behind them?
I think it would make a huge difference. Just having the commitment to say that we want manufacturing to stay from government communication is really, really important. We know that recently the different departments were broken or separated and changed and shifted, and BEIS was changed into the Department for Business and Trade, but they dropped the language of industrial strategy from that title, which sends the wrong signals to manufacturers because it suggests that it's not a priority for them. And we know that often when we speak to our members, they often highlight countries like Germany and France and how they treat their manufacturing sector as not just an industry, but actually a sector of national security importance. So it's like almost like the defense sector, where France would treat its agricultural sector as important as its own defense sector, because it's an issue around national security, about protecting its people, about protecting its citizens. And I think we could benefit from viewing manufacturers in the same light, where businesses that produce food and drink and all the things that people need to consume domestically, actually these things have a strategic role in the nation's survivability. And it was proven during the pandemic, where many manufacturers were able to change their production processes to start producing ventilators, to start producing PPE, things that they have not done before, but they could do that because it was important for the country at the time. So I think that's very, very important. And I know many businesses are currently concerned about how the US is currently operating with the ERA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the massive amounts of subsidies, I think exceeding 300 billion for the manufacturing sector, which we could not necessarily as a country compete with the deep pockets of the US. And manufacturers are actually seeing, from a patriotic perspective, they would rather stay in the UK if they can. But from a business perspective, they look at the US and think we could thrive over there. And many businesses are looking at actually what countries are better placed. And it is a huge area of topic or discussion for Make UK. In fact, we are looking into pushing government to actually put a focus on an industrial strategy. Some of you may have heard recently, but the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt recently, during a spring statement, said that there was going to be we don't know what this is, but it's called a manufacturing moment in sometime in May. So we are capitalizing on that opportunity to produce our own industrial strategy paper to be released on, I think, the 9th of May. And we're expecting something in the following week around announcements related specific to the manufacturing sector. We don't know what the government's going to say about that and what policies could be introduced. But we are somewhat optimistic that there is going to be some day dedicated, very similar to how we had the Green Day for energy efficiency announcements, something like that.
Okay. Well, I guess to wrap up, the final question then, and this goes back to the report, and probably picks up on some of the things you just mentioned there. But There is prevailing headwind and a significant risk of manufacturers becoming stressed or distressed during 2023. Can you just talk a little bit about what you mean by that, and obviously what approach maybe manufacturers should be taking?
Yeah. So we sort of touched on it a little bit earlier, but then we are being very cautious about the challenges that businesses face. The OBR and the ONS and many other economists have been expecting consumer inflation rates to fall, and despite slowing down, they have not been falling fast as they have estimated, because what we see from our own data is manufacturers are still passing on higher prices at unprecedented rates, primarily because they made significant losses in 2022, and they are trying to recoup those losses to ensure that their margins stay positive. We also find that there is no actual answer to the labor shortages issue. We talked about the different countries, and one thing I didn't mention is that the increase in economic inactivity and how older workers have left the workforce in manufacturing. The story is slightly different between the UK and European countries, where in European countries, we've seen those workers who left the workforce during the pandemic actually returned in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, those countries. They went back to work. But the UK is the only country across Europe, or the G7, where people who have left the workforce have not returned. And the government have responded by introducing something called returnerships, which is basically just normal apprenticeships, but for older workers. But we don't necessarily see that having a huge impact on increasing the labor force. And there's still a challenge there that businesses who have the ambition to grow may not necessarily be able to do so. And the third thing is, so there's the labor, there's the inflation, and the third thing is the energy costs. We know that energy prices on the wholesale markets are coming down, but that actually has yet to benefit any business, partly because energy providers, and it's not their fault specifically, are having to pass on high costs that they're facing from their own insurance companies. So many manufacturers have been reporting to us that when they're re-signing new tariffs, they're being asked to pay upfront very, very high fees, like security deposits that exceed, in most cases, the size of the entire cost of their energy bills for an entire year. Because what we had in 2021, I think it was, or maybe it was 2022, many energy companies went bust. We would have seen that in the media. That created a response from the insurance markets that insure these companies to raise the premiums on energy providers. And energy providers, they're businesses too. They need to be able to run efficiently as well. They're passing on those costs to the customers, which are the businesses that use those energies, which often we see as quite unfair. But we have been raising that with government quite directly. And we do worry that could have a big impact when it comes to manufacturers who start need to renewing those tariffs, which many businesses have not yet done because they are still on fixed terms that started about a year ago.
Wow, yes. So as you rightly point out, still some headwinds there. Well, Fhaheen, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. You've given us some great insights. I'm looking forward to seeing obviously how Q2 goes, and hopefully we get a better picture for the rest of the year after that. But thank you again for your time.